Welcome to Sleepless History, where we explore the past in soothing detail to help you drift into peaceful rest. I'm your host, and tonight we're embarking on a gentle journey through the history of the first American colonies. In this episode, we'll explore the establishment, daily life, and lasting impact of these early settlements along the eastern seaboard of what would become the United States. So, find a comfortable position, close your eyes if you wish, and let's travel back in time together to the early 1600s, when European settlers first established permanent communities in the New World. If you enjoy this video or learn something new, please don't forget to like the video and subscribe. It helps this channel more than you may think. Part 1. The Beginnings. Our story begins not in America, but across the Atlantic Ocean in Europe during the late 1500s and early 1600s. England, Spain, France, and the Netherlands were locked in competition for wealth, territory, and influence. The discovery of the Americas by Christopher Columbus in 1492 had opened up vast new possibilities, and by the turn of the 17th century, European powers were eager to establish permanent settlements in these distant lands. The Spanish had already established successful colonies in Central and South America, extracting enormous wealth in gold and silver. The English, watching from across the Channel, were determined not to be left behind. Queen Elizabeth I had granted charters to explorers and merchants, hoping to replicate Spain's success. But early English attempts at colonization had met with failure. The most famous of these failures was the Roanoke colony, established in 1587 on an island off the coast of present-day North Carolina. When supply ships returned to the colony in 1590, they found it completely abandoned. The only clue left behind was the word Croatoan carved into a wooden post. The fate of the colonists remains one of history's enduring mysteries. This disappearance, while tragic, didn't extinguish English ambitions in the New World. Instead, it taught valuable lessons about the challenges of establishing settlements so far from home. As the 1700s dawned, England was ready to try again. The country had stabilised after the tumultuous reign of Elizabeth, and James I now sat on the throne. Merchants and investors, organised into joint stock companies, were willing to risk their capital on the promise of New World riches. Two companies in particular would shape the course of American history: the Virginia Company of London and the Virginia Company of Plymouth. In April of 1607, 3 small ships departed England, carrying 104 settlers and crew members. The Susan Constant, the Godspeed, and the Discovery sailed across the Atlantic, a journey that took approximately 4 months. These weren't explorers or adventurers in the traditional sense. Most were gentlemen, craftsmen, and labourers seeking fortune and opportunity. Few had any experience with farming or wilderness survival, a fact that would soon prove nearly fatal to the enterprise. On May 14th, 1607, these settlers landed on a marshy peninsula along the James River in present-day Virginia. They named their settlement Jamestown in honour of King James. The location seemed ideal for defence against potential Spanish attacks, as the river was deep enough for ships to anchor close to shore. However, the site had significant drawbacks that the settlers would soon discover. The water was brackish and contaminated. The land was swampy and filled with disease-carrying mosquitoes, and the surrounding area offered limited opportunities for agriculture. The first summer at Jamestown was devastating. Disease spread rapidly through the settlement. Malaria, dysentery, and typhoid fever claimed victim after victim. The gentlemen among the settlers, accustomed to lives of leisure in England, were ill prepared for the hard labour required to build shelters, plant crops, and fortify the settlement. By September of 1607, more than half of the original settlers had died. The survivors faced starvation as their food supplies dwindled and they proved incapable of growing sufficient crops or hunting game. The Powhatan Confederacy, a powerful alliance of Algonquian-speaking tribes led by Chief Wahun Senakau, whom the English called Chief Powhatan, watched these struggling foreigners with a mixture of curiosity and concern. The indigenous peoples of the region had lived in this land for thousands of years, developing sophisticated agricultural practices, social structures, and trading networks. To them, these English settlers seemed remarkably incompetent at basic survival. Relations between the settlers and the Powhatan were complex from the beginning. The indigenous peoples initially provided corn and other food to the starving colonists, perhaps viewing them as potential trading partners or believing they would soon leave. However, tensions arose as it became clear the English intended to stay permanently. The settlers, desperate for food, sometimes raided indigenous villages, taking corn by force. These actions created a cycle of retaliation and mistrust that would characterize much of the colony's early years. One figure emerged as crucial to Jamestown's survival during this period: Captain John Smith. Smith was a soldier of fortune who had fought against the Ottoman Empire in Eastern Europe before joining the Jamestown expedition. Unlike many of the gentleman settlers, Smith understood the necessity of hard work and strict discipline. In September of 1608, he became the colony's president and instituted a policy that would become famous: "He that will not work shall not eat." Smith's leadership was controversial but effective. He forced the gentlemen to labour alongside common workers, organised expeditions to trade with indigenous villages, and imposed military discipline on the settlement. His accounts also gave us one of early America's most famous, if possibly embellished, stories: his capture by the Powhatan and his rescue by Chief Powhatan's daughter, Pocahontas. While the exact details of this incident remain debated by historians, it's clear that Pocahontas, whose indigenous name was Matawaka, played a significant role in early Jamestown. She apparently visited the settlement frequently, bringing food and messages from her father. Despite Smith's efforts, Jamestown remained precarious. In October of 1609, Smith was injured in a gunpowder explosion and returned to England. His departure ushered in what colonists would call the starving time, the winter of 1609 to 1610. Cut off from indigenous trade by deteriorating relations, the settlers consumed everything they could find: horses, dogs, cats, rats, and even leather from their boots. Archaeological evidence suggests some colonists resorted to cannibalism. Of the approximately 500 colonists present at the beginning of winter, only about 60 survived until spring. The colony came within days of being abandoned entirely. In May of 1610, when supply ships finally arrived, the survivors were preparing to board vessels and return to England. Only the timely arrival of a new governor, Lord Delaware, with additional supplies and settlers, convinced them to stay. This moment marked a turning point. The Virginia Company began recruiting settlers more aggressively, offering inducements like land ownership. More importantly, the colonists began to discover a product that could make Virginia profitable: tobacco. Indigenous peoples throughout the Americas had cultivated tobacco for thousands of years, using it in religious ceremonies and as medicine. Spanish colonists in the Caribbean had begun shipping tobacco to Europe, where it quickly became fashionable, despite initial opposition from King James, who famously called smoking loathsome to the eye, hateful to the nose, harmful to the brain, and dangerous to the lungs. A colonist named John Rolfe, who would later marry Pocahontas, experimented with tobacco cultivation in 1612. He obtained seeds of a variety from Trinidad and Caracas, which was milder than the indigenous Virginia varieties. The resulting crop was a tremendous success. Tobacco proved ideally suited to Virginia's climate and soil, and European demand seemed insatiable. By 1617, the colony was exporting 20,000 pounds of tobacco annually. This number would grow exponentially in the following years. Tobacco transformed Virginia from a struggling settlement on the verge of collapse into a profitable enterprise. However, this success came at a cost. Tobacco was a labour-intensive crop, requiring constant attention during the growing season. The demand for labour would shape Virginia's development in profound and ultimately tragic ways. Initially, the colony relied on indentured servants, people who agreed to work for a set period, usually 4 to 7 years, in exchange for passage to America and the promise of land afterward. But as tobacco cultivation expanded, the demand for labour would eventually lead to the establishment of chattel slavery, a system whose consequences would echo through American history for centuries. While Jamestown struggled and eventually found its footing in Virginia, other English settlers were preparing to establish colonies farther north. These settlers had different motivations than the profit-seeking merchants of Jamestown. They were religious dissenters seeking freedom to worship according to their conscience, away from the Church of England. To understand these colonists, we must briefly turn our attention back to England. The Protestant Reformation had swept through Europe in the 1500s, challenging the Catholic Church's authority and fragmenting Christianity into numerous denominations. In England, King Henry VIII had broken with Rome in 1533, establishing the Church of England with the monarch as its head. However, many English Protestants felt the Church of England hadn't gone far enough in its reforms and still retained too many Catholic practices. These Protestants, often called Puritans because they wished to purify the Church, faced persecution in England. A group of particularly radical Puritans, known as separatists, concluded they needed to separate entirely from the Church of England. This was dangerous. Religious dissent was considered treason, and separatists faced imprisonment or worse. One group of separatists fled to the Netherlands in 1608, settling in the city of Leiden, where they found religious tolerance. However, after more than a decade in Holland, they grew concerned that their children were becoming too Dutch and losing their English identity. They decided to seek a new home in the Americas. These separatists negotiated with the Virginia Company for a land patent and secured financial backing from London merchants. In September of 1620, 102 passengers boarded a ship called the Mayflower in Plymouth, England. Only about 40 of these passengers were separatists, whom we now call pilgrims. The rest were hired craftsmen, servants, and other colonists seeking economic opportunity. After a grueling 66-day voyage across the Atlantic, during which one passenger died and one was born, the Mayflower sighted land on November 9th, 1620. However, they were far north of their intended destination in Virginia. They had reached Cape Cod in present-day Massachusetts. Facing winter and storms, they decided to settle there rather than continue southward. This created a legal problem. Their land patent was for Virginia, not this territory. To establish a framework for self-government, 41 male passengers signed an agreement known as the Mayflower Compact before disembarking. This document, while brief, was significant in American history as an early example of self-governance based on the consent of the governed. The Pilgrims spent several weeks exploring Cape Cod Bay before choosing a site for their settlement. On December 21st, 1620, they landed at a place the English explorer John Smith had named Plymouth on a map from his 1614 expedition. The indigenous people, the Wampanoag, called this area Patuxet. Tragically, European diseases brought by earlier explorers and traders had devastated the local population. A plague, likely smallpox or leptospirosis, had swept through the region between 1616 and 1619, killing perhaps 90% of the indigenous inhabitants. The Pilgrims found cleared fields and abandoned homes, grim evidence of the catastrophe. That first winter at Plymouth was as brutal as Jamestown's early years. The colonists remained on the Mayflower for months as they built shelters. Disease, malnutrition, and the harsh New England winter took a terrible toll. By spring, only 53 of the original 102 passengers remained alive. Nearly every family had lost members. The settlement's survival hung by a thread. In March of 1621, the colonists received unexpected visitors. An Abenaki man named Samoset walked into Plymouth and greeted them in broken English. He introduced them to another indigenous man named Tisquantum, known as Squanto, who spoke fluent English. Squanto's story was remarkable and tragic. He was originally from Patuxet and had been kidnapped by an English explorer in 1614 and taken to Spain. He escaped, made his way to England, and finally returned home in 1619, only to find his entire village wiped out by disease. He was possibly the sole survivor of his people. Squanto served as interpreter and intermediary between the Pilgrims and Massasoit, the chief sachem of the Wampanoag Confederacy. Massasoit, whose people had also been decimated by disease, and who faced threats from rival tribes, apparently saw potential benefit in an alliance with these English settlers. In late March of 1621, Massasoit and the Plymouth colonists signed a peace treaty that would last for more than 50 years. Squanto taught the Pilgrims crucial survival skills: how to plant corn using fish as fertilizer, where to catch eels and shellfish, which plants were edible and which were poisonous, and how to hunt deer. Without this assistance, Plymouth Colony would likely have joined Roanoke in the list of failed settlements. In the fall of 1621, after a successful harvest, the Pilgrims held a celebration of Thanksgiving, feasting for 3 days with Massasoit and 90 Wampanoag people. While this wasn't the first Thanksgiving celebration in the colonies, and it wouldn't become an annual tradition for many years, it would eventually be mythologized as the origin of the American Thanksgiving holiday. Plymouth Colony grew slowly but steadily. Unlike Jamestown, which focused on tobacco cultivation and profit, Plymouth emphasized community and religious devotion. The colonists established a system of self-governance through town meetings, where male church members could vote on community matters. This participatory system, though limited by modern standards, was remarkably democratic for its time. In 1630, a much larger group of Puritans, though not separatists, established the Massachusetts Bay Colony near present-day Boston. Led by John Winthrop, about 1,000 colonists arrived with a royal charter granting them extensive self-governing powers. Winthrop famously declared that their colony would be a city upon a hill, a model Christian community that the world would look to. This sense of special purpose, of being an example to others, would become deeply embedded in American identity. The Massachusetts Bay Colony differed significantly from both Jamestown and Plymouth. It was well financed, with wealthy investors among its leaders. The colonists were predominantly families rather than single men, which contributed to stability. They were educated, many had attended university, and they arrived in large numbers, with 17 ships bringing over 1,000 colonists in that first year alone. By 1640, approximately 20,000 people had migrated to Massachusetts in what historians call the Great Migration. These New England colonies developed a character distinct from Virginia. The rocky soil and harsh climate weren't suitable for large-scale agriculture or cash crops like tobacco. Instead, settlers focused on subsistence farming, fishing, and eventually shipbuilding and trade. Towns clustered around harbours and meeting houses. Education was emphasised. Massachusetts passed a law in 1647 requiring towns of 50 families or more to establish schools because literacy was necessary to read the Bible. Harvard College was founded in 1636, just 16 years after the Pilgrims landed, to train ministers. However, the Puritan colonies were not havens of religious tolerance. The Puritans had fled persecution in England, but they proved equally intolerant of dissent in their own communities. Religious conformity was strictly enforced. Those who questioned Puritan doctrine or authority faced punishment, banishment, or worse. This rigid orthodoxy would lead to conflict and ultimately to the founding of additional colonies. One famous dissenter was Roger Williams, a minister who arrived in Massachusetts in 1631. Williams held radical views for his time. He argued that the colonial charter was invalid because it didn't recognize indigenous peoples' land rights. He advocated for complete separation of church and state, believing that government involvement corrupted religion. And he insisted on true religious freedom, including for non-Christians. These views were unacceptable to Massachusetts authorities. In 1635, Williams was banished from the colony in the middle of winter. Williams fled south and was aided by Wampanoag and Narragansett peoples who knew him and respected his fair dealings with them. In the spring of 1636, he founded a settlement he called Providence on land he purchased from the Narragansett. This settlement became the nucleus of Rhode Island, which Williams chartered as a colony based on religious freedom and separation of church and state. Rhode Island became a refuge for religious minorities. Baptists, Quakers, Jews, and others found tolerance there when they faced persecution elsewhere. Another dissenter was Anne Hutchinson, a midwife and religious teacher who held meetings in her home where she discussed sermons and shared her own theological interpretations. Hutchinson advocated for a personal, direct relationship with God that didn't require ministerial intermediation. She also challenged the authority of ministers, suggesting some were under a covenant of works rather than a covenant of grace. These teachings, and perhaps equally importantly, her influence as a woman religious leader, threatened the Puritan hierarchy. In 1637, she was put on trial for heresy and sedition. Though she initially defended herself skillfully, she ultimately made statements that her judges considered blasphemous, claiming direct revelation from God. She was banished from Massachusetts and moved to Rhode Island, then later to New Netherland, where she and most of her family were killed in an Indigenous attack in 1643. The founding of Rhode Island illustrates a pattern that would repeat throughout colonial history. Dissenters, misfits, and those seeking opportunity would push the boundaries of settlement, founding new colonies and expanding the colonial presence. Connecticut was founded in 1636 by colonists from Massachusetts seeking better land. New Haven was established separately in 1638 by Puritans who thought Massachusetts wasn't strict enough. These settlements would eventually merge into Connecticut Colony. Meanwhile, other European powers were establishing their own colonial footholds. The Dutch established New Netherland, centered on the Hudson River, with its capital at New Amsterdam on Manhattan Island. Dutch colonization was primarily commercial rather than religious. The Dutch West India Company, chartered in 1621, established trading posts to profit from the fur trade. New Amsterdam became a diverse, cosmopolitan port, home to speakers of 18 different languages by some accounts. The Dutch were relatively tolerant, at least by 17th century standards. While the Dutch Reformed Church was favoured, other Protestants and even Jews could worship privately. The colony attracted settlers from across Europe: Dutch, Germans, Scandinavians, French Huguenots, and others. This diversity would influence the region's character long after the Dutch were gone. Swedish colonists established New Sweden along the Delaware River in 1638. Though this colony was small and short-lived, absorbed by New Netherland in 1655, Swedish settlers introduced log cabin construction to the Americas, a building technique that would become iconic on the American frontier. In the Chesapeake region, Virginia was joined by Maryland. George Calvert, the first Lord Baltimore, was a Catholic and sought to establish a colony where Catholics could practice their faith freely. His son Cecil inherited this charter, and in 1634, the first colonists arrived in Maryland. Like Virginia, Maryland's economy became centered on tobacco cultivation. Interestingly, despite being founded as a Catholic haven, Maryland established policies of religious tolerance, partly because Catholics remained a minority even in their own colony. The Maryland Toleration Act of 1649 guaranteed religious freedom to all Christians, though it prescribes death for anyone who denied the divinity of Jesus. Let us pause here for a moment and reflect on what we've covered so far. By the middle of the 1600s, the eastern seaboard of North America hosted numerous European colonies with distinct characters. Virginia and Maryland in the Chesapeake were tobacco colonies with an emerging plantation economy. Massachusetts, Plymouth, Connecticut, and New Haven in New England were Puritan communities emphasizing religious devotion, education, and community cohesion. Rhode Island was a haven for religious dissenters. New Netherland was a commercial trading colony with remarkable diversity. These colonies, while all claiming European origin, were developing in different directions, shaped by their geography, their economies, and the motivations of their founders. Part 2. Daily life in the colonies. Now, let us turn our attention to what daily life was actually like for the people who lived in these early colonies. When we think of colonial America, we often picture images from later periods: prosperous farms, elegant plantation houses, bustling port cities. But life in the early 1600s was far more precarious and primitive than these later images suggest. Let's begin with the most basic necessity: shelter. The first colonists at Jamestown lived in tents and crude shelters made of branches and mud. Even as the settlement became established, houses remained simple. Most were 1 or 2 rooms, with walls made of wooden frames filled with wattle and daub, a mixture of woven sticks plastered with mud, clay, and animal hair. Roofs were typically thatched with reeds or grass. These structures were dark, smoky, and drafty. Fires for cooking and heating were constant dangers. Many early colonial structures burned down. In New England, colonists initially built similar simple structures, but fairly quickly developed a distinctive style that would become iconic: the New England saltbox house. These had heavy timber frames, clapboard siding, and steeply pitched roofs designed to shed heavy snow. Chimneys were massive stone or brick structures in the center of the house, designed to heat multiple rooms. Windows were small and covered with oiled paper, or, for the wealthy, expensive imported glass. These houses were built to last. Some examples from the mid-1600s still stand today. Furniture was sparse and functional. Most families owned only a few pieces: a table, benches, or stools, perhaps a chest for storing clothing and valuables, and a bed. Wealthy colonists might have chairs, a luxury item. Beds were expensive and often shared by multiple family members. Children and servants might sleep on straw mattresses on the floor or in lofts. Privacy, as we understand it, barely existed. Families ate, worked, slept, and lived in close quarters. Food was a constant concern, especially in the early years of each colony. The colonists faced a fundamental challenge. They were trying to recreate English diets and farming practices in a very different environment. Wheat, the staple grain of England, grew poorly in much of colonial America. Colonists gradually learned from indigenous peoples to rely on corn, which they called maize or Indian corn. Corn became the foundation of the colonial diet in all regions. A typical meal in early Virginia or Maryland might consist of cornmeal mush or hominy, perhaps with some salted pork or fish if available. In New England, the diet was similar but included more fish, especially cod, which was abundant in northern waters. Colonists also gathered oysters, clams, and other shellfish, which were plentiful. Wild game, including deer, turkey, and waterfowl, supplemented the diet, though hunting was time-consuming and not always successful. Vegetables included pumpkins, squash, and beans, all of which colonists learned to cultivate from indigenous peoples. The Three Sisters agricultural system, where corn, beans, and squash were grown together in mutually beneficial ways, was widely adopted. English vegetables like peas, cabbage, turnips, and onions were also grown when possible. Fruit was scarce initially. Colonists tried to establish orchards of apples, pears, and peaches, but these took years to mature. Meanwhile, they gathered wild berries and fruits. Water was often unsafe to drink due to contamination, so colonists, including children, drank weak beer or cider most of the time. The alcohol was sufficient to kill some bacteria, making these beverages safer than water. Preserving food was crucial for survival, especially in New England where winters were long. Colonists salted and smoked meat and fish. Vegetables were pickled or dried. Root vegetables could be stored in cellars. Still, late winter and early spring, before new crops could be harvested, and when preserved foods were running low, were times of hunger and hardship. Cooking was labor-intensive, dangerous work performed almost entirely by women. Large fireplaces dominated colonial kitchens. Meals were cooked in iron pots hung over the fire or placed directly on coals. Bread was baked in Dutch ovens. The cook had to manage the fire constantly, adding wood, adjusting pots, and somehow avoiding burning herself or her clothing. Many colonial women bore scars from cooking accidents. Clothing was handmade and precious. Most colonists owned only a few sets of clothes. Fabric was expensive, whether imported from England or homespun from wool or flax grown in the colonies. Making cloth was enormously time-consuming. Flax had to be grown, harvested, retted in water to separate the fibers, beaten, combed, spun into thread, and woven into linen. Sheep had to be raised, sheared, the wool cleaned, carded, spun, and woven. These tasks occupied countless hours of women's labour. Clothing styles were simpler than in England, but followed the same basic patterns. Men typically wore shirts, breeches that ended at the knee, stockings and shoes or boots. In cold weather, they added doublets or jerkins. Women wore shifts as undergarments, with skirts and bodices over them, and aprons to protect their clothing while working. Children dressed similarly to adults, though small children of both sexes wore gowns that made diaper changing easier. The Puritans of New England are famous for supposedly wearing only black, but this is a myth. While they did dress plainly, avoiding lace and other decorative flourishes, they wore a variety of colours. Black dye was actually expensive, so everyday clothing was more often brown, grey, green, or the natural colours of undyed wool and linen. Wealthier colonists did dress more elegantly, displaying their status through fine fabrics and fashionable cuts, though always stopping short of the elaborate court fashions of England. Personal hygiene was quite different from modern standards. Bathing the entire body was rare and considered potentially dangerous to health. Instead, colonists washed hands and faces regularly and changed linen undergarments, which absorbed sweat and oils from the skin. Hair was combed and cleaned with oils. Teeth were cleaned with rags, sometimes with salt or soot as a cleaning agent. Dental health was generally poor, and tooth decay was common and painful, with few remedies available. Let us consider the daily routine of a typical colonial family. Days began early, at dawn, or even before. In a farming household, which was most households, men and older boys would head out to the fields after a quick breakfast. The agricultural work varied by season. Spring meant ploughing and planting. Summer brought constant weeding, tending livestock, and repairing tools and buildings. Fall was harvest time, the busiest season, when everyone worked long hours to bring in crops before the first frost. Winter allowed for some rest from field work, but brought its own tasks. threshing grain, caring for livestock, repairing equipment, and cutting firewood. Women's work was equally demanding and never-ending. They prepared meals which required hauling water, tending fires, and cooking from scratch. They preserved food, made butter and cheese, spun thread, wove cloth, sewed and repaired clothing, cared for children, maintained gardens, cared for poultry, made soap and candles, and cleaned the house. Laundry was an exhausting, all-day task performed perhaps once or twice a month, involving hauling and heating water, scrubbing clothes, and spreading them to dry. Children in colonial families were expected to work from an early age. Young children might feed chickens, gather eggs, shell peas, card wool, or watch younger siblings. As they grew older, boys learned farming and trades from their fathers or masters if they were apprenticed out. Girls learned housewifery from their mothers. Childhood as a carefree period of play and education was a luxury few colonial families could afford. Education varied greatly by region and class. In New England, education was valued highly because Puritans believed everyone should be able to read the Bible. Massachusetts' 1647 law requiring towns to maintain schools was unusual for the time. In practice, schooling was often informal, with children learning to read and write from parents, ministers, or in small dame schools run by women in their homes. Boys from wealthy families might attend grammar schools that taught Latin and Greek, preparing them for college. In the southern colonies, education was more haphazard. Wealthy families hired tutors or sent sons to England for education. The children of poorer colonists often received little or no formal education. Literacy rates were lower in Virginia and Maryland than in New England, though still higher than in most of Europe at the time. Literacy was gendered. Most boys learned to read and write, at least in New England. Girls learned to read, but fewer were taught to write, as it was considered less necessary for their domestic roles. Still, many colonial women were literate and actively engaged with written material, especially religious texts. Religion permeated daily life, particularly in New England. The Sabbath, Sunday, was strictly observed. No work was permitted, no cooking beyond reheating food prepared the day before, no travel except to church, no play or entertainment. Everyone was required to attend lengthy church services, often lasting several hours, sometimes twice a day. Sermons could last 2 hours or more. Church attendance was mandatory and enforced. Those who skipped services faced fines. During the week, families held daily devotions, with prayer and Bible reading morning and evening. Grace was said before meals. Religious instruction was constant. Children learned to read from religious texts and memorized catechisms, question and answer summaries of religious doctrine. In Virginia and Maryland, religious life was less intense but still important. The Anglican Church was established by law, though enforcement was often lax. Churches were fewer and farther between in the more dispersed southern settlements, so worship might be less frequent than in compact New England towns. Still, most colonists considered themselves Christians and participated in religious life. Social life in the colonies was shaped by the harsh realities of survival and by the close-knit nature of small communities. Entertainment was simple and often combined with necessary work. Corn huskings, barn raisings, and quilting bees were social occasions where neighbours gathered to help with labour-intensive tasks while enjoying companionship. These gatherings might include food, drink, and sometimes music and dancing, though Puritans were suspicious of frivolous entertainment. Weddings, while joyous occasions, were fairly simple affairs. Puritan weddings were civil ceremonies, not religious ones, performed by magistrates rather than ministers. Southern colonists followed Anglican traditions with church weddings. Regardless of region, weddings were typically followed by feasting and celebration, scaled to the family's means. Courtship was fairly brief and practical. Young people had limited opportunities to socialize, usually at church, community work events, or through family visits. Parents often arranged marriages, though young people usually had some say in the match. Marriage was essential for economic survival and social standing. Single adults were uncommon and sometimes viewed with suspicion. Widows and widowers typically remarried quickly, partly for practical reasons. Running a household required both male and female labour. Let us speak now of the darker aspects of colonial life. Death was a constant presence. Infant mortality was staggeringly high. Perhaps 1 in 3 children died before reaching age 5. Childhood diseases like measles, smallpox, and diphtheria were often fatal. Women faced significant risks in childbirth. Many women died giving birth or from complications afterward. It was common for a man to outlive 2 or even 3 wives. Life expectancy for those who survived childhood was better than these figures might suggest, but still lower than today. A person who lived to adulthood might expect to reach their 50s or 60s, though many died younger from disease, accident, or in women's cases, childbirth. Medical care was primitive and often dangerous. Doctors were rare in the colonies, particularly in rural areas. Most medical care was provided by women in the family, using herbal remedies and traditional practices. Some treatments were helpful, many were useless. Some, like bleeding patients, were actively harmful. Crime and punishment in the colonies would seem harsh by modern standards. Petty crimes like theft, public drunkenness, or breaking the Sabbath might be punished by time in the stocks or pillory, devices that held offenders in public view where they could be mocked and pelted with rotten vegetables. More serious crimes could result in whipping, branding, having ears cropped, or even execution. The death penalty could be applied for murder, of course, but also for crimes like adultery, blasphemy, or witchcraft, at least in law books, though execution for these crimes was rare in practice. Justice was often swift and informal. In small communities, everyone knew everyone else's business. Social pressure and shame were powerful forces for maintaining order. Disputes might be resolved by community leaders or ministers, rather than formal courts. Still, the colonies did develop legal systems modelled on English law, with courts, sheriffs, and increasingly formal procedures as the colonies matured. Let us turn our attention now to slavery and indentured servitude, which were fundamental to colonial labour systems. As mentioned earlier, Virginia and Maryland relied initially on indentured servants for labour. These were people, usually young men, who agreed to work for a master for a set term in exchange for passage to America, room and board during service, and freedom dues at the end of their term. Typically some money, clothing, tools, and sometimes land. Indentured servitude was harsh. Servants had few rights during their terms of service. They could be bought and sold, though their servitude would end after the agreed term. They could be punished physically by their masters. They couldn't marry without permission. If they ran away and were caught, their terms could be extended. Still, indentured servitude was temporary. Those who survived their terms gained freedom and the possibility of joining colonial society as landowners and citizens. The first Africans arrived in Virginia in 1619, brought by a Dutch ship. Initially, their status was ambiguous. Some appear to have been treated as indentured servants, eventually gaining freedom. Others were held in permanent bondage. Through the 1620s, 30s, 40s, and 50s, the number of enslaved Africans in the Chesapeake colonies remained small, numbering in the hundreds rather than thousands. However, beginning in the 1660s and accelerating in the 1680s and 1690s, the Chesapeake colonies underwent a dramatic transformation. Planters increasingly turned from indentured servants to enslaved Africans for labour. Several factors drove this change. The English economy improved, reducing the number of desperate people willing to indenture themselves. Indentured servants who gained freedom demanded land, creating political tensions. Bacon's rebellion in 1676, a violent uprising led by a wealthy planter named Nathaniel Bacon that united indentured servants, former servants, and enslaved people against the colonial government, shocked Virginia's elite and convinced them that freed servants were dangerous. Meanwhile, England became more involved in the Atlantic slave trade. The Royal African Company, chartered in 1660, began shipping enslaved Africans directly to English colonies. Planters discovered that perpetual, heritable slavery was more profitable than temporary indentured servitude. Children born to enslaved mothers were themselves enslaved, creating a self-perpetuating labour force. Colonial legislatures began passing laws that defined and hardened racial slavery. Virginia's laws from the 1660s through 1690s established that slavery was hereditary through the mother, that Christian baptism didn't grant freedom, that enslaved people were property that could be bought and sold, and that killing an enslaved person during punishment was not murder. These laws transformed slavery from one labour system, among others, into a racial caste system based on the false ideology that Africans and their descendants were innately inferior and suited to perpetual bondage. By 1700, Virginia and Maryland had several thousand enslaved Africans, and the number was growing rapidly. Slavery would become the foundation of the Southern colonial economy and a defining feature of American society, with consequences that echoed through the Civil War and beyond, indeed to the present day. New England colonies also had slavery, though on a smaller scale. Without plantation agriculture, the demand for large numbers of labourers was lower. Still, enslaved Africans and indigenous people worked in northern colonies as domestic servants, artisans, and labourers. New England merchants grew wealthy from the slave trade, building ships, distilling rum that was traded for enslaved people in Africa, and transporting enslaved people to Caribbean and southern colonies. Indigenous peoples also suffered terribly during this period. The arrival of Europeans brought devastating epidemics. Smallpox, measles, typhus, and other diseases swept through indigenous communities, killing perhaps 90% of the native population in some regions. Indigenous peoples had no immunity to these old world diseases, and entire villages were wiped out. Surviving populations were displaced as European settlement expanded. Relations between colonists and indigenous peoples were complex, varying by time, place, and circumstances. There were periods of peaceful coexistence, trade, and even cooperation. Many colonists married indigenous women, adopted indigenous agricultural practices and technologies and relied on indigenous trade networks. Some colonists, like Roger Williams, advocated for respecting indigenous land rights and dealing fairly with indigenous peoples. However, conflict was common and often brutal. Colonists pushed onto indigenous lands, either ignoring indigenous claims or purchasing land through questionable treaties. When indigenous peoples resisted, violence erupted. Wars between colonists and indigenous confederacies became increasingly common as the 1600s progressed. These conflicts were characterized by raids, counter-raids, and atrocities on both sides. One of the most devastating was King Philip's War, fought in New England from 1675 to 1678. King Philip, known to the colonists, was actually Metacom, the son of Massasoit, the Sachem who had signed the peace treaty with Plymouth 50 years earlier. By the 1670s, English settlement had expanded dramatically, encroaching on Wampanoag lands and threatening indigenous ways of life. When Plymouth Colony executed 3 Wampanoag men for murder in 1675, tensions exploded into war. The war was catastrophic. Indigenous warriors attacked dozens of English towns, destroying 12 entirely and damaging many others. They killed hundreds of colonists. In response, the colonists and their indigenous allies conducted a campaign of extermination. They burned indigenous villages, destroyed food supplies, killed warriors, and sold women and children into slavery in the Caribbean. Metacom was killed in August of 1676, his body mutilated, his head displayed on a pike in Plymouth for decades. The war ended with indigenous power in southern New England broken. Thousands of indigenous people had been killed or displaced. The region's indigenous population never recovered. For the colonists, the war was proportionally the deadliest in American history. About 1 in 10 adult men in New England died, and the economy was devastated. The war demonstrated both the colonists' determination to expand and the terrible cost of conflict. Part 3. Colonial Development and Expansion. As we move into the later 1600s and early 1700s, the colonies began to develop more distinct identities and more complex societies. Let us explore how the colonies evolved during this period. New colonies were founded, filling in the Atlantic seaboard. In 1664, England seized New Netherland from the Dutch. The conquest was bloodless. New Amsterdam's governor, Peter Stuyvesant, surrendered without a fight. New Amsterdam became New York, named for the Duke of York, the king's brother. The diverse, tolerant character of Dutch New Amsterdam influenced English New York, which remained more cosmopolitan and tolerant than some other English colonies. The Duke of York granted the land between the Hudson and Delaware rivers to 2 of his friends, creating New Jersey. This colony attracted diverse settlers, English Puritans, Scottish Presbyterians, Dutch Reformed, Quakers, and others. New Jersey developed a reputation for religious tolerance and ethnic diversity. In 1681, King Charles II granted an enormous tract of land to William Penn to settle debts the crown owed to Penn's father. Penn was a Quaker, a member of the Society of Friends, a religious group that had faced severe persecution in England. Quakers rejected formal clergy, insisted on the spiritual equality of all people, including women, refused to swear oaths or showed deference to social superiors, and were pacifists. These beliefs enraged authorities. Quakers had been imprisoned, tortured, and executed in England and were unwelcome in most American colonies. Massachusetts had hanged 4 Quakers in the 1650s and 1660s. William Penn envisioned his colony, Pennsylvania, as a holy experiment in religious tolerance and peaceful relations with indigenous peoples. Pennsylvania's frame of government guaranteed religious freedom to all believers in God. Penn advertised throughout Europe, attracting Quakers, but also German Lutherans, Reformed, and members of pietist sects seeking religious freedom. The colony's capital, Philadelphia, whose name means brotherly love, was carefully planned with a grid pattern of streets, public squares, and building codes. Penn also insisted on purchasing land from indigenous peoples rather than simply claiming it by charter. He learned indigenous languages, met personally with Delaware leaders, and negotiated treaties. While later, Pennsylvania officials didn't always live up to Penn's ideals, his initial efforts established relatively peaceful relations. Pennsylvania prospered quickly, with fertile land attracting farmers and Philadelphia becoming a major port. South of Virginia, colonization proceeded more slowly. The land that would become the Carolinas was granted to 8 proprietors in 1663. Settlement was sparse until 1670, when colonists established Charlestown, later called Charleston, in what is now South Carolina. The early Carolina economy was diverse, including timber, naval stores like tar and pitch, and trade with indigenous peoples. However, planters soon discovered that the coastal lowlands were ideal for growing rice. Carolina planters imported enslaved Africans who had rice-growing expertise from West Africa, and the colony developed a plantation economy even more dependent on slavery than Virginia or Maryland. By the early 1700s, enslaved Africans outnumbered European colonists in South Carolina, a demographic unique among the English mainland colonies. Georgia, the last of the 13 original colonies, wasn't founded until 1733. James Oglethorpe and other trustees envisioned Georgia as both a buffer against Spanish Florida and as a charitable colony where England's worthy poor could start fresh. Initially, Georgia prohibited slavery and limited landholdings to small plots, hoping to create a society of small farmers. However, these restrictions proved unpopular and were eventually abandoned. Georgia became another plantation colony with slavery, though it remained less developed than the older colonies. By the early 1700s, the English colonies stretched from Massachusetts to Georgia, a distance of over 1,000 miles. However, these weren't unified in any meaningful sense. Each colony had its own charter, its own government, its own laws. They were all subjects of the English crown and followed English law, but they had limited interaction with each other and often very different interests. Colonial governments evolved throughout this period. Most colonies had a governor appointed by the crown or proprietors, or in Massachusetts and Rhode Island, elected by colonists. Governors had significant power, commanding militias, granting land, appointing officials, vetoing legislation. However, they were often checked by colonial assemblies, legislatures elected by property-owning men. These assemblies controlled taxation and budgets, giving them leverage over governors who needed money to operate. This system created ongoing tension between royal authority and colonial self-governance. Governors tried to assert crown control, assemblies defended what they saw as their rights as Englishmen. These conflicts foreshadowed later revolutionary tensions, but in this period, most colonists still thought of themselves as loyal English subjects seeking their rightful liberties, not as Americans seeking independence. Town and county governments handled local matters. In New England, the town meeting was central to political life. Male property owners in each town met regularly to discuss issues, pass local laws, elect officials, and levy taxes. This direct democracy was unusual and created a culture of political participation. In the South, county courts dominated local government, with appointed justices handling legal matters and administration. Voting rights were limited but broader than in England. Generally, white men who owned a certain amount of property could vote for assembly representatives and local officials. Propertyless men, all women, enslaved people, and free black people were excluded. Indigenous peoples were not considered citizens. Still, perhaps 50 to 75% of white men could vote, a much higher proportion than in England, where only about 5% of men could vote. Economic development accelerated during this period. Agriculture remained dominant. In the Chesapeake, tobacco was king. Virginia and Maryland planters grew wealthy shipping tobacco to England, though tobacco prices fluctuated and the crop exhausted soil quickly, forcing constant clearing of new land. In the Carolinas, rice and later indigo, a plant used to make blue dye, became major exports. In the Middle Colonies, Pennsylvania, New York, New Jersey, and Delaware, wheat farming thrived. These colonies became the breadbasket, exporting grain to other colonies and to the Caribbean. New England's rocky soil limited agriculture, but the region developed other industries. Fishing, especially for cod, was enormously important. New England ships fished the Grand Banks off Newfoundland, bringing back cod that was dried and salted. Some was consumed locally, but much was exported to Catholic southern Europe and to Caribbean plantations, where enslaved people were fed the cheapest grade of salt cod. Whaling developed as an industry, providing oil for lamps and whalebone for corsets and other goods. Shipbuilding became a major industry in New England and the Middle Colonies. The abundant forests provided timber, and colonial shipyards could build vessels cheaper than English yards. By the mid-1700s, about 1/3 of British merchant ships were built in American colonies. Trade grew increasingly important and complex. The colonies exported raw materials, tobacco, rice, indigo, fish, timber, furs, and naval stores. They imported manufactured goods from England, clothing, tools, furniture, books, and luxury items. However, direct trade with England didn't balance. The colonies imported more from England than they exported, creating a trade deficit. To earn money to buy English goods, the colonies developed a complex trade network. Colonial ships carried fish, grain, and timber to the Caribbean, where they traded for sugar and molasses. Molasses was brought back to New England and distilled into rum. Rum was shipped to Africa and traded for enslaved people who were transported to the Caribbean or southern colonies. Ships returned with sugar or molasses, completing the cycle. This triangular trade, really a complex network of many routes, enriched colonial merchants but depended on slavery and the slave trade. England tried to control colonial trade through the Navigation Acts, a series of laws passed beginning in 1651. These laws required that colonial trade be carried on English or colonial ships, that certain goods like tobacco could only be shipped to England or other English colonies, and that European goods destined for the colonies had to pass through England first, allowing English merchants to profit. These laws were meant to ensure that colonial trade benefited England. Colonists resented these restrictions and widely evaded them through smuggling. Colonial merchants traded with French and Dutch Caribbean islands despite prohibitions, bribed customs officials, and falsified documents. Enforcement was lax. England had little administrative presence in the colonies. Still, the Navigation Acts created ongoing friction between England and the colonies. Cities began to grow during this period, though they remained small by European standards. Boston, founded in 1630, was New England's largest city, a centre of trade, shipbuilding, and cod fishing. By 1700, it had about 7,000 residents. New York, formerly New Amsterdam, was a diverse, bustling port. Philadelphia, founded in 1682, grew rapidly due to Pennsylvania's tolerant policies and productive agriculture. By 1740, Philadelphia rivaled Boston in size. Charleston was the South's major port, exporting rice and slaves. These cities were centers of commerce, culture, and increasingly colonial identity. Urban life differed markedly from rural life. Cities had more diverse populations, with merchants, artisans, laborers, sailors, shopkeepers, and enslaved people living in close proximity. Cities had more entertainment, taverns, coffee houses, theatres, though Puritans in Boston tried to suppress frivolous amusements. Cities had more churches representing different denominations. They had schools, printing presses, newspapers, and bookshops. Ideas circulated more freely in cities, connecting colonists to currents of thought in England and Europe. Social stratification became more pronounced as the colonies matured. In the earliest years, most colonists were roughly equal in their poverty and struggle for survival. But by the late 1600s and early 1700s, clear class differences had emerged. At the top were the wealthy elite, large planters in the South, like the Byrd, Carter, and Lee families of Virginia, who owned thousands of acres and hundreds of enslaved people. Wealthy merchants in the northern cities, and major landowners. These families lived in increasingly elegant houses, imported luxury goods, educated their children in England, and dominated colonial politics. They modelled themselves on the English gentry, though with a rougher, more pragmatic edge. Below them was a middling sort, smaller planters and farmers who owned their land, and perhaps a few enslaved people or servants, successful artisans, shopkeepers, and minor officials. This was the largest group of free colonists. They lived comfortably, if not luxuriously, and had political rights. Many aspired to join the elite. At the bottom of white society were landless labourers, indentured servants, and the poor. These people lived precarious lives, working for wages or completing terms of servitude, often struggling to survive. Below them in the social hierarchy were free black people, a small group that included people who had been freed from slavery or were descended from the ambiguous first generations of Africans in the Chesapeake. Free black people faced discrimination and limited rights, but weren't enslaved. At the very bottom were enslaved Africans and African Americans, whose number was growing rapidly. By 1750, enslaved people made up about 20% of the colonial population, but this varied dramatically by region. In South Carolina, enslaved people were the majority. In Virginia, they were 40% of the population. In the northern colonies, they were a much smaller percentage, but still present in every colony. The culture of the colonies was evolving into something distinctly American, neither fully English, nor indigenous, nor African, but a new hybrid. Language was changing. American English was developing distinct pronunciation, vocabulary borrowed from indigenous languages, Dutch, German, and African languages. Words like moose, skunk, canoe, and hickory came from indigenous languages. Cookie, waffle, and sleigh came from Dutch. This linguistic evolution reflected the colony's diverse influences. Architecture blended European traditions with adaptations to American conditions and materials. The New England saltbox house, the Southern plantation house with its wide porches, the Pennsylvania German barn, all reflected this adaptation. Building techniques and materials from indigenous peoples and enslaved Africans also influenced colonial architecture, though this wasn't always acknowledged. Food culture was a fusion. English traditional dishes persisted, but were transformed by American ingredients. Corn, beans, squash, turkey, cranberries, maple syrup, all indigenous foods, became staples of colonial cuisine. African enslaved people brought knowledge of rice cultivation, okra, black-eyed peas, and cooking techniques that influenced southern food. The colonies were literally creating a new cuisine from multiple traditions. Music and dance in the colonies blended traditions. English folk songs and dances were popular, but these were influenced by African rhythms and instruments brought by enslaved people and by indigenous music. Fiddle music, which would become central to American folk traditions, was developing in the colonies, drawing on Scottish, Irish, English, and African traditions. Religion remained central to colonial life, but it too was evolving. The Great Awakening, a series of religious revivals that swept through the colonies in the 1730s and 1740s, transformed American religion. Charismatic preachers like George Whitefield and Jonathan Edwards attracted enormous crowds with emotional, theatrical sermons emphasizing personal religious experience and conversion. This differed from traditional emphasis on formal theology and minister authority. The Great Awakening had several important effects. It undermined established church authority, as revivalists criticized unconverted ministers and encouraged believers to seek genuine spiritual experience regardless of social standing or education. This had democratizing implications. It also transcended colonial boundaries. Whitefield preached from Georgia to Massachusetts, giving colonists from different regions a shared experience. It increased religious diversity as new denominations and sects formed, and it established revivalism as a recurring feature of American religious life. Education expanded during this period. Grammar schools and colleges were founded. Besides Harvard, established in 1636, the College of William and Mary was founded in Virginia in 1693, Yale in Connecticut in 1701, the College of New Jersey, later Princeton, in 1746, and others. These were religious institutions training ministers primarily, but they also educated the colonial elite in classical subjects and created networks of educated men who would lead the colonies. Printing presses appeared in the colonies, first in Massachusetts in 1638, later in other colonies. By the early 1700s, printers were publishing books, pamphlets, and newspapers. The first colonial newspaper, Public Occurrences both foreign and domestic, appeared in Boston in 1690, but was immediately suppressed for publishing without authorization. The Boston News Letter, founded in 1704, was the first continuously published newspaper. By mid-century, several colonies had newspapers, which helped create a public sphere where colonists could debate issues and develop common identities. Intellectual life flourished, especially in cities. Colonists imported books from England and Europe, though they were expensive. Libraries were founded, often as subscription libraries where members paid fees for borrowing rights. Coffee houses and taverns became venues for discussing politics, philosophy, and science. Some colonists made original contributions to knowledge. Benjamin Franklin, born in Boston in 1706, became internationally famous as a scientist, inventor, writer, and statesman, embodying the Enlightenment ideal of the practical philosopher. The Enlightenment, an intellectual movement emphasizing reason, science, and human progress, influenced educated colonists. They read Locke, Newton, and other Enlightenment thinkers. These ideas about natural rights, social contracts, and government by consent would later influence revolutionary thought. But in the first half of the 1700s, most colonists still saw themselves as loyal British subjects, proud of their English heritage and liberties. Part 4. Relations between colonies and with indigenous peoples. Let us now examine how the colonies related to each other and to the indigenous peoples who still controlled most of the continent. Relations between the English colonies themselves were limited in the early years. Each colony was more connected to England than to other colonies. Governors and officials corresponded with London, not with neighbouring colonies. Trade with England was more important than intercolonial trade. Colonists identified with their specific colony as Virginians or Massachusetts men, not as Americans. However, intercolonial contact did exist and grew over time. Merchants traded between colonies. Colonists migrated from one colony to another, seeking land or opportunity. Letters and newspapers circulated, spreading news and ideas. Religious leaders travelled between colonies, especially during the Great Awakening. These connections created the beginnings of a shared colonial culture. Formal cooperation between colonies was rare and usually prompted by external threats. The New England Confederation, formed in 1643 by Massachusetts, Plymouth, Connecticut, and New Haven, was created for mutual defense against indigenous peoples and potential Dutch aggression. It coordinated military efforts and settled boundary disputes, but had no power to enforce decisions. It dissolved in 1684. Intercolonial relations weren't always friendly. Boundary disputes were common and sometimes bitter. Connecticut and Rhode Island argued over borders for decades. Pennsylvania and Maryland fought over their boundary. New York and New Jersey, New Hampshire and Massachusetts, Virginia and Maryland all had disputes. These were eventually settled, usually by appeals to England, but they demonstrated that colonists had no sense of common identity that transcended their individual colonies. Economic competition created tensions. Virginia tried to prevent Maryland from trading tobacco, wanting to maintain a monopoly. Massachusetts merchants competed with New York and Philadelphia for trade dominance. The colonies didn't see themselves as partners, but as rivals, united only by their common allegiance to England. However, conflicts with France and Spain and wars with indigenous peoples did push colonies toward limited cooperation. In 1689, England entered a series of wars with France that would continue intermittently for almost 70 years. These European wars had American theatres where English and French colonies fought each other, usually with indigenous allies. King William's War from 1689 to 1697 saw raids and counter-raids between New England and New France, as French Canada was called. The French and their indigenous allies, particularly the Abenaki, attacked frontier towns in Maine, New Hampshire, and Massachusetts, killing or capturing settlers. English colonists retaliated with attacks on French settlements. The war was brutal and inconclusive, ending with a treaty that restored the pre-war status quo. Queen Anne's War, from 1702 to 1713, was similar but more extensive. Fighting extended to the southern frontier, where English Carolina colonists and their indigenous allies fought Spanish Florida and its indigenous allies. Again, the war was marked by frontier raids and atrocities. Again, it ended inconclusively for the colonies, though Britain gained Newfoundland, Nova Scotia, and Hudson Bay from France in the Treaty of Utrecht. These wars demonstrated the colonies' vulnerability. They couldn't effectively defend themselves without help from Britain. They also demonstrated the importance of indigenous alliances. Both French and English colonists relied on indigenous warriors. The Iroquois Confederacy, also known as the Haudenosaunee, consisting of 6 nations in present-day New York, became a crucial power broker, playing French and English off against each other. In 1754, the Albany Congress brought together representatives from 7 colonies to discuss common defense during the French and Indian War. Benjamin Franklin proposed the Albany Plan of Union, which would have created a unified colonial government for defense and indigenous relations. The plan was rejected by both the colonial assemblies and the British government. Colonies were unwilling to surrender power to a central authority, and Britain feared a united America might be harder to control. Still, the Congress represented an important step toward intercolonial cooperation. Relations with indigenous peoples varied enormously depending on time, place, and circumstances. In some times and places, relations were relatively peaceful, characterized by trade, intermarriage, and coexistence. In others, they were marked by violence and mutual hostility. Generalizing is difficult, but several patterns emerge. Trade was central to relations. Indigenous peoples wanted European goods, metal tools, firearms, cloth, and other manufactured items. Europeans wanted indigenous goods, furs, deerskins, corn, and indigenous peoples' knowledge of the land. This mutual desire created extensive trading networks. The fur trade was particularly important. Indigenous hunters trapped beaver, otter, and other animals and traded pelts to European merchants, who shipped them to Europe, where they were made into fashionable hats and coats. The fur trade brought wealth to indigenous communities, but also created dependencies and rivalries. The introduction of European trade goods transformed indigenous societies. Metal axes and knives were more efficient than stone tools. Firearms changed warfare and hunting. Cloth was easier to work than animal skins. However, dependency on European trade created vulnerabilities. When trade was disrupted, indigenous peoples suffered. European traders often exploited indigenous peoples, using alcohol as a trade good despite its devastating social effects. Disease remained the most catastrophic impact of European contact. Wave after wave of epidemics swept through indigenous communities throughout the colonial period. Smallpox, measles, typhus, influenza, and other diseases killed millions. Entire nations were decimated. Survivors were often traumatized, their social structures shattered, their populations too small to maintain traditional ways of life. This demographic collapse was the single greatest tragedy of colonization and made indigenous resistance to European expansion ultimately futile. Land was the fundamental point of conflict. European colonists wanted land for farming. Indigenous peoples used land for hunting, gathering, and agriculture, but conceived of land use differently than Europeans. Europeans believed in private property, permanent individual ownership of specific parcels. Indigenous peoples generally believed land was communal, used by the group and not permanently owned by individuals. When Europeans purchased land from indigenous peoples, the two parties often understood the transaction differently. Indigenous leaders might think they were granting Europeans the right to use the land, perhaps expecting rent or gifts in return, while retaining their own use rights. Europeans thought they were buying permanent, exclusive ownership. This fundamental misunderstanding led to countless conflicts. European colonists often simply took land without negotiation or compensation, either by force or by treating it as vacant when indigenous peoples weren't visibly using it in European ways. The legal doctrine of vacuum domicilium, empty land, held that land not being farmed in European fashion could be claimed. This ignored indigenous land use practices like hunting, gathering, seasonal migration, and shifting cultivation. As European settlement expanded, indigenous peoples were progressively pushed off their lands. Some sold land and moved west, ahead of settlement. Some fought to defend their territories. Some tried to adapt, adopting European farming techniques and Christianity. None of these strategies ultimately prevented dispossession. Warfare between colonists and indigenous peoples was frequent and brutal. These weren't European-style battles between armies, but raids, ambushes, and attacks on settlements and villages. Both sides killed non-combatants, though colonists often characterize such acts by indigenous peoples as savage atrocities while justifying their own as necessary war measures. Several major conflicts shaped colonial indigenous relations. We've already discussed King Philip's War in New England. The Pequot War of 1636 to 1638 was even earlier and established patterns that would recur. The Pequot, a powerful nation in Connecticut, resisted English expansion. In retaliation for Pequot attacks, Massachusetts and Connecticut colonists, with Mohegan and Narragansett allies, attacked a Pequot village on the Mystic River in 1637. They surrounded the village at dawn and set it on fire, shooting anyone who tried to escape. Between 400 and 700 Pequot people died, mostly women, children, and elderly men, as warriors were away. This massacre shocked even the colonists' indigenous allies, but English leaders saw it as a righteous act against heathens. In the South, The Yamasee War of 1715 to 1717 was sparked by South Carolina colonists' abuses in the deerskin trade. The Yamasee and allied nations attacked settlements, killing several hundred colonists. Carolina colonists retaliated brutally, nearly exterminating the Yamasee. The war forced indigenous peoples to abandon coastal regions and demonstrated Carolina colonists' ruthlessness. These wars followed a pattern. Indigenous peoples, threatened by expansion or outraged by mistreatment, attacked colonial settlements. Colonists retaliated with superior numbers and firepower, often targeting villages rather than just warriors. They destroyed food supplies and villages, forcing starvation and displacement. They sold captured indigenous people into slavery. The wars typically ended with indigenous peoples defeated, their populations reduced, and their lands taken. However, not all indigenous peoples were defeated in this period. The Iroquois Confederacy remained powerful throughout the colonial period. The Five Nations, later Six Nations, after the Tuscarora joined in 1722, controlled present-day upstate New York and portions of surrounding regions. The Iroquois were skilled diplomats who played European powers against each other, maintaining their independence and territorial control. The Cherokee in the southern Appalachians, the Creek Confederacy in present-day Georgia and Alabama, and other nations also remained powerful. However, their long-term prospects were grim. European colonists kept coming, their population kept growing, and their hunger for land was insatiable. Indigenous peoples could win battles, but were losing the demographic war. By the mid-1700s, colonists outnumbered indigenous peoples in regions that had been overwhelmingly indigenous a century earlier. Some indigenous peoples tried to adapt to the European presence. Missionaries, particularly Jesuits in New France and Puritans in New England, attempted to convert indigenous peoples to Christianity. Some indigenous people converted, perhaps hoping to improve relations or because Christian teachings resonated with them. Praying towns were established in New England, where Christian indigenous people lived, farmed in European fashion, and adopted European dress and customs. However, these converts were often treated as second-class Christians by colonists and were caught between two worlds, rejected by their own people but never fully accepted by Europeans. Intermarriage between European men and indigenous women occurred, particularly in frontier regions and in New France, where it was more common than in English colonies. These marriages could create bonds between communities and produce children who bridged both worlds. However, English colonists generally discouraged intermarriage, viewing it as degrading. The famous marriage of John Rolfe and Pocahontas in 1614 was exceptional and was used to demonstrate the possibility of civilizing indigenous peoples. Looking at the bigger picture, indigenous peoples faced an impossible situation. European diseases decimated their populations. European trade goods made them dependent. European settlers took their lands. European firearms and military tactics gave colonists military advantages, though indigenous peoples were often skilled fighters who inflicted heavy casualties. But most importantly, European colonists kept coming in ever-increasing numbers. Indigenous peoples couldn't match this demographic growth. Their political fragmentation, with many different nations often at odds with each other, prevented unified resistance. Meanwhile, colonists, despite their own disunity, could ultimately call on Britain's support. By the mid-1700s, the tide had clearly turned. Indigenous peoples still controlled most of the continent's interior, but the Atlantic coast was increasingly dominated by European colonists. The indigenous peoples who remained in colonial regions faced dispossession, assimilation, or extermination. This was a tragedy of immense proportions, the destruction of entire societies and ways of life, a process that would continue for another century and a half. Part 5. The Impact and Legacy. As we approach the conclusion of our journey through the history of the first American colonies, let us reflect on their impact and legacy. These early settlements, established between 1607 and the early 1700s, profoundly shaped the future United States and influenced the world in lasting ways. First, the colonies established the foundations of American society. The patterns set in this early period, demographic, economic, political, and cultural, shaped the nation that would eventually emerge. The regional differences between New England, the Middle Colonies, and the South, which originated in this period, influenced American politics and society for centuries. New England's emphasis on education, town meetings, and religious intensity created a culture of civic participation and moral purpose. The region's diverse economy, based on trade, fishing, and small-scale manufacturing, made it relatively egalitarian, at least among white men. This heritage influenced American ideas about democracy, education, and social reform. The Middle Colonies' diversity and tolerance created a pluralistic culture. Pennsylvania's Quaker heritage of religious freedom and peaceful relations influenced American ideals of tolerance. The region's productive agriculture and commercial vitality contributed to American prosperity. The Middle Colonies' ethnic and religious diversity foreshadowed America's future as a nation of immigrants. The South's plantation economy and slave-based society created a hierarchical agricultural culture focused on land ownership and social status. The Cavalier myth, the idea of Southern gentlemen presiding over elegant plantations, though it obscured the brutal reality of slavery, shaped Southern identity. The South's commitment to agriculture and its reliance on slavery created tensions with the North that would ultimately lead to civil war. Slavery was perhaps the most tragic and consequential legacy of the colonial period. The system of racial chattel slavery developed in the colonies, particularly after 1660, created a racial caste system that denied the humanity of Africans and their descendants. Slavery was profitable, enriching planters, merchants, and shippers in all regions. But it was also morally monstrous, an institution that treated human beings as property, separated families, enforced obedience through violence, and denied enslaved people any rights or freedoms. The contradiction between American rhetoric about liberty and the reality of slavery troubled some colonists even in this period. Quakers began to question slavery in the late 1600s. But most colonists accepted slavery as natural or necessary, or simply didn't question it. The ideology of racial inferiority that justified slavery poisoned American society. When slavery was finally abolished after the Civil War, its legacy of racism, discrimination, and inequality persisted. The effects are still felt today. Understanding that slavery and racism have deep roots in the colonial period is essential to understanding American history. The displacement and destruction of indigenous peoples was another profound tragedy with lasting consequences. Millions of indigenous people died from disease, war, and displacement. Entire nations disappeared. Survivors lost their lands and were forced onto ever-shrinking territories. Their cultures were suppressed, their children taken away to boarding schools, their religions banned. This process of dispossession and cultural genocide, which began in the colonial period, continued long after. Indigenous peoples endured and survived, maintaining their identities and cultures despite centuries of oppression. Today, indigenous nations continue to fight for their rights, their lands, and recognition of past injustices. This too is part of the colonial legacy. The colonies also established political traditions that shaped American democracy. The idea that governments derive their legitimacy from the consent of the governed, though limited to property-owning white men in this period, was more radical than it might seem. Colonial assemblies, while not fully democratic by modern standards, created a tradition of representative government. Town meetings in New England practiced direct democracy. These experiences prepared colonists for self-government. Colonial resistance to perceived overreach by governors and by England planted seeds of revolutionary sentiment. Colonists believed they possessed the rights of Englishmen: trial by jury, no taxation without representation, freedom from arbitrary government. When they felt these rights were threatened, they protested and resisted. This tradition of jealously guarding liberties and resisting authority seen as tyrannical became central to American political culture. The religious diversity and experimentation of the colonies, despite periods of intolerance, ultimately contributed to American religious freedom. Roger Williams' Rhode Island, William Penn's Pennsylvania, and Maryland's Catholic Refuge all established that religious pluralism was possible. The Great Awakening's emphasis on personal religious experience and its challenge to established religious authority further undermined the idea of a single state church. While some colonies maintained established churches into the Revolutionary period and beyond, the tradition of religious diversity and the practical difficulty of enforcing religious uniformity in such a diverse society made religious freedom increasingly inevitable. Economically, the colonies integrated North America into the Atlantic economy. They exported raw materials, imported manufactured goods, and participated in complex trading networks spanning 4 continents. This integration brought wealth to some and created the economic foundations for future prosperity. It also created dependencies and vulnerabilities, as colonists discovered during wartime disruptions of trade. The development of a market economy, where land, labour and goods were bought and sold, and where people produced for markets rather than just for subsistence, was another colonial legacy. This market economy was built on the backs of enslaved people, exploited indigenous peoples, and the hard labour of indentured servants and free colonists. But it was also dynamic and growth-oriented characteristics that would define the American economy. Culturally, the colonies were creating something new. American English, American food, American architecture, American music, all were emerging from the fusion of English, African, indigenous, and other influences. Americans were developing a distinct identity, though they wouldn't fully recognize it yet. They thought of themselves as British subjects living in America, but they were becoming Americans. The colonies were also sites of intellectual ferment. The Enlightenment ideals of reason, science, and progress found fertile ground. Americans contributed to science, like Benjamin Franklin's experiments with electricity. They developed political theories, drawing on European thinkers like Locke, but adapting them to American conditions. The colonies' printing presses, newspapers, libraries, and colleges created a public sphere where ideas could be debated. This intellectual vitality would contribute to the revolutionary ferment of the late 1700s. The colonial period also established America's relationship with the rest of the world. The colonies were part of the British Empire, the world's most powerful empire by the mid-1700s. They participated in British wars, traded within the imperial system, and looked to London as the centre of culture and power. Yet they were also distant from Britain, separated by 3,000 miles of ocean and several months sailing. This distance gave them practical autonomy in daily affairs while keeping them tied to Britain. The colonies' relationship with other European powers, particularly France and Spain, was antagonistic. Colonial wars were extensions of European rivalries. The colonies existed in a world of imperial competition, where European powers jockeyed for territory, trade, and strategic advantage. This competition would intensify in the mid-1700s, leading to conflicts that would transform the colonies and eventually lead to independence. For the world beyond America, the colonies were part of the broader process of European expansion and colonization. The Spanish, Portuguese, Dutch, French, and British all established colonies in the Americas. The enormous wealth extracted from the Americas, the crops domesticated by indigenous Americans that spread around the world, and the labour of millions of enslaved Africans forcibly transported to American plantations, all transformed the global economy. The Columbian Exchange, the transfer of plants, animals, diseases, technologies, and people between the old and new worlds, was one of the most significant events in world history. American crops like corn, potatoes, tomatoes, and chocolate spread to Europe, Africa, and Asia, transforming diets and enabling population growth. European crops, animals, and technologies spread to the Americas. Unfortunately, Old World diseases devastated indigenous American populations, and the African slave trade depopulated regions of Africa while enriching European and American slave traders and plantation owners. The English colonies in particular established models that would be replicated elsewhere. The joint stock company model used to finance Jamestown influenced later corporate development. The plantation system pioneered in the Caribbean and southern colonies would be replicated in other colonial settings. The settler colonial model, where large numbers of European settlers displaced indigenous populations, was used by British colonies in Australia, New Zealand, and elsewhere. The colonies also contributed to the development of modern racism and slavery. While slavery existed in many societies throughout history, the racial chattel slavery developed in the Americas was distinctive in its scale, its hereditary nature, and its racial justification. The ideology that black people were innately inferior, developed to justify slavery, spread throughout the Atlantic world, and had consequences far beyond the Americas. By the mid-1700s, after nearly 150 years of colonization, the English colonies had become firmly established. They had survived the starving times, the disease, the conflicts with indigenous peoples. They had developed functioning economies, stable governments, and distinct cultures. They had grown from a few hundred struggling settlers to a population of over 1 million, soon to be 2 million. The colonies produced exportable goods: tobacco, rice, indigo, wheat, fish, timber, and ships. They imported manufactured goods and luxuries from Britain and traded throughout the Atlantic world. They had cities, towns, farms, and plantations. They had churches, schools, colleges, and newspapers. They had wealthy elites, a middling sort of farmers and artisans, and large populations of enslaved people and poor labourers. They also had a growing sense of their own identity and interests, which didn't always align with Britain's. They valued their self-governing traditions and resented interference. They were proud of being British subjects, but were developing a distinctly American character. These tensions would intensify in the 1760s and 1770s, leading to revolution and independence. But that is a story for another time. For now, as we conclude our journey through the early colonial period, let us remember both the achievements and the tragedies of this era. The colonists demonstrated remarkable courage, perseverance, and ingenuity in establishing settlements in a challenging environment. They created new societies that blended multiple traditions. They established foundations for representative government and religious freedom. But we must also remember the immense suffering caused by colonization, the millions of indigenous people who died from disease and violence, whose lands were stolen, whose cultures were suppressed. The millions of Africans enslaved, transported across the ocean in horrific conditions, forced to labor in brutal bondage, denied their humanity and freedom. The indentured servants who endured years of harsh servitude, the women whose labor and contributions were essential but often unrecognized and unrewarded. The history of the first American colonies is a complex tapestry of human experience, hope and despair, courage and cruelty, achievement and tragedy. Understanding this history in all its complexity is essential to understanding America. The patterns established in this period, the good and the bad, shaped the nation that emerged. The legacies of this era, positive and negative, remain with us today. As we close, let us reflect on what we can learn from this history. The colonists' courage in facing adversity, their willingness to start anew in a distant land, their capacity for hard work and innovation, these remain admirable. Their establishment of self-governing traditions and their eventual embrace of religious freedom contributed to American democracy. But we must also learn from the injustices of this era. The treatment of indigenous peoples and enslaved Africans was profoundly wrong. The inequality and exploitation built into colonial society violated the human dignity of millions. Recognizing these injustices, understanding how they shaped American society, and working to address their ongoing legacies is essential. History is not just about the past. It shapes the present and influences the future. The story of the first American colonies is not just about people who lived hundreds of years ago. It is about the foundations of the society we live in today. Understanding where we came from helps us understand where we are and where we might go. And so, as you drift off to sleep, perhaps you'll dream of those distant times, of ships crossing the Atlantic, of settlers building new lives in a strange land, of indigenous peoples defending their homes, of enslaved people enduring unimaginable hardships, of Jamestown and Plymouth, of tobacco fields and town meetings, of conflicts and cooperation, of the complex, contradictory, fascinating story of America's beginnings. Thank you for joining me on this journey through the history of the first American colonies. May you sleep well, and may these stories from the past give you perspective on the present and hope for the future. This has been Sleepless History. Good night.